Hello? There we go. Ooh, all right. All right. Hi everyone. Welcome to my talk on how to cultivate psychological safety in the context of reliability management. Now, before I continue on, this is still on, right? Okay, cool. Before I continue on, I'll begin by saying that while this talk is centered on reliability management, it's generalizable to many other contexts. We'll talk about incident management, which put another way is crisis management, sustainable organizations, and leadership in general. So just a little bit of background on me. I kind of spoiled it on the boba and the dogs, but I'm currently a staff engineer on the reliability engineering org at the New York Times. And within that, I focus on making our systems observable across all of the times. And so over the course of my career, I've been on many engineering teams, and each of these teams was special in its own way. Each had its own unique way of doing things, its own unique set of problems, but in spite of all these complexities that each of these teams had, two things generally remain true. The first is that teams always perform better when they feel psychologically safe. I'm sure this isn't surprising, right? Psychological safety is something we actually talk a lot about in tech, especially since the pandemic started. But what I really want to emphasize here is that psychological safety is even more important for site reliability engineering because of the nature of our work. Every engineer has at least one story of a time they took down production or deleted some database. And the reason we remember those things so vividly is because they were stressful at the time, especially if those things happened when we were less senior. Incident management is stressful. It's a vulnerable time for our systems, but it's also a vulnerable time for ourselves. We're more prone to mistakes during times of stress, and we fear the consequences of mistakes that aren't our individual fault, whether it's potential consequences of a culture that lacks blamelessness, or knowing the impact that comes every time your applications are down. And this is why reliability-focused teams need to be particularly thoughtful about building a psychologically safe environment. And so I'll spend the rest of our time reviewing the principles and practices I've found to be effective for reliability-focused teams. But before I do that, let me take a step back and talk about how I came to develop my style of leadership. So I mentioned briefly that I'm a staff engineer, but previous to that, I was in ed tech on Google for Education and some startups. And before that, I also did computational research focused on the education sector, worked as an analyst at an education nonprofit, and spent hundreds of my spare hours tutoring, teaching, and mentoring students. And so, in other words, I've been thinking about education my entire career. And one of the reasons for that is because I've always been obsessed with this idea that education should be a place where students are empowered to learn and become their best selves. And so many years ago, I encountered this idea of trauma-informed education or trauma-informed teaching, which is basically a methodology that considers how trauma impacts learning and behavior in the classroom. And this approach resonated deeply as a woman of color in the United States, where we face the daily trauma of racist patriarchy, and as someone who's purposeful about working on teams that don't look like the cast of Silicon Valley. And so when I think about building psychologically safe teams, I come from an approach that's influenced by the principles of trauma-informed education. Now, trauma-informed education actually has 7 core principles, but I'm going to focus on 3 that influence my approach the most to building teams. And so first, we have that psychological safety is created by building trust through respect, acceptance, and transparency. And so what this means practically is that we can build trust by making the expectations of our teams and culture clear. There's an uneasiness that comes with ambiguity, especially during times of crisis. And this uneasiness is distracting, and it makes us more vulnerable to mistakes that have social and technical consequences. And so we can strive for standard practices while also making it clear that mistakes and failure are an inevitable consequence of engineering and of being people. And simultaneously, we must show respect for one another by preparing for the fact that we need to strike a healthy balance of standardization and flexibility to accommodate the diverse attributes of our teams and our systems. And so by driving this clarity, we can both show respect and acceptance that's required for building and understanding, and therefore trust. Secondly, the importance of empowerment, voice, and choice. We don't build choice with a team and just assume that we have it forever, right? This needs to be maintained continuously and renewed every single day. And so a winning strategy for that is to continuously empower folks to raise challenges and issues that because they can trust that they'll be addressed, or even feel empowered to address them themselves. We'll talk about this more later, but engineering is all about feedback loops, and so building feedback loops that incorporate the voices of the members of your team is crucial to maintaining trust and empowering your engineers. And lastly, we have inclusion. The psychological safety of everyone on the team needs to be a top priority, and harm and bias should never be tolerated. We build our culture with the most vulnerable people in mind first, because when we build for the most vulnerable people in mind, we're way more likely to end up building for everyone in mind. And so tech has historically been ineffective at prioritizing the experiences of marginalized people and of our most vulnerable selves. And so we must adopt our way of building culture and teams so that those of us who have been historically excluded are safe, supported, and embraced. All right, so far we've focused on the importance of psychological safety and some of the principles behind that, but I mentioned that there are two things that always remain true for every team I've worked on. And the second is that chronic issues are the most common threat to psychological safety. And what I mean by this is that chronic problems threaten psychological safety by eating away at your team's ability to be resilient, to change, and more importantly, failure. And the longer that chronic problems go unaddressed, the more you risk burning out even some of the strongest teams. And so what do I actually mean when I say a chronic issue? What does that actually mean? It's kind of ambiguous, so let's characterize it further. So I define two main characteristics that distinguish chronic issues. The first is that these issues are repetitive and long-lasting, right? Think of a team or community that you're part of now. If you've been on that team long enough, you can probably pretty quickly identify some issues that you see come up over and over again, right? And the severity of these chronic issues can vary widely, right? But each of these poses some risk to your culture. At worst, they are those services or tools that break painfully often, so your on-call folks are having to constantly debug production issues. At best, they are those flaky end-to-end tests that you keep ignoring because they pass on retry, but in the back of your head, you know you should probably address them before it comes back to bite you in the butt. The second is that these problems tend to be very difficult to solve, and this is usually why they become chronic in the first place. But this is also part of why they're so important to solve, because chronic issues are some of our biggest indicators of complexity and organizational dysfunction. Reliability teams deal with chronic issues all the time, whether that's in the form of recurring monitors that frequently need to be actioned or toil. And so now let's tie these back to our principles from earlier. How do chronic issues impact our ability to hold true to our principles? So starting with trust, acceptance, and transparency. When something is around for so long that you can depend on it to happen, and it's something that we collectively consider an issue, that probably means some shared value or principle is being violated. And maybe it's on the more simpler side, like your code base being chronically under-tested, and that being an indicator that we're not meeting our org's definition of production ready. Or maybe it's something more severe, like that person who keeps saying things they shouldn't, and yet no one says anything despite saying we all care about diversity and inclusivity. These situations make people lose trust in your abilities team to hold truth to your values and its ability to handle any kind of conflict. Secondly, chronic issues directly impact the team's sense of empowerment, right? Again, when an issue is allowed to go on for so long, especially without action, people are left feeling unheard and like they're unable to do anything about the situation that they're in. And this kind of acquired hopelessness is never healthy. Now, there needs to be some sorts of flexibility that enables teams to prioritize issues they deem important to improving how they work, whether that's through feedback loops with important stakeholders, or making time for teams to express some sort of creative freedom. And lastly, chronic issues are also inclusion issues, because chronic issues are felt by the most vulnerable people first. And so this is a point that's easily lost, so I'm going to repeat it in different words. The flaws of our organization are always felt by our most vulnerable employees first. And so I'll elaborate on this by talking about a personal example where I felt this in the context of how my team worked. So I have a seizure disorder that's sometimes pretty disruptive to my life. Prior to the pandemic, work from home wasn't nearly as common and sometimes not allowed altogether. And even when my workplace was accommodating to my needs, it didn't save me from the feelings of exclusion that I began to feel. In an environment where I was already set apart from others because of who I am, it was just another thing to make me feel like I didn't belong. And so, this is a pretty common experience for disabled folks. Years spent advocating for accommodating workplaces and being told that it could never work, only to see this suddenly shift into 2020. And so imagine reconciling the relief that we could finally be accommodated with the anger that things could have been all this way all along. And so we advocated for the benefits of remote work, which is ultimately the amount of flexibility it provides to serve our individual lives and needs. And the consequence of chronically ignoring the needs of disabled people was that a lot of companies and employees really struggled to transition to remote work during a time where our lives were literally at stake. And so had we listened to those employees long ago, we could have all been reaping the benefits of remote work for much longer than the last 3 years. And instead, not only did we lose the opportunity of what could have been all these years, we also lost people in the process, right? People literally lost their lives because we didn't transition to work from home quickly enough. And this is just one example of many where everyone could have benefited from building our workplace with the most vulnerable people in mind first. And there's a version of this type of issue that exists for every vulnerable or marginalized community. Furthermore, bias is a chronic issue itself. Even the healthiest cultures have bias embedded in them. And so when I asked you all to think of a chronic issue that you've seen before, if you couldn't come up with one, bias is the first one that you can start with, because I guarantee that it's a problem for someone. And so how do you make sure chronic issues don't kill your culture, right? Where are these points of intervention? So I define 3 approaches to handling chronic issues. The first is preventative, the second is proactive, and the last, which is the one that we always want to avoid as much as possible, is reactive. The preventative approach requires you to design processes and systems that prevent these problems in the first place. And this ties back to what I mentioned earlier about striking the right balance between standardization and flexibility. By using our collective context to inform how we strike this balance, we can design systems or processes that age and scale well. We won't be able to prevent all of our problems, but it can reduce the number of problems and keep our teams focused on harder problems that will mature your teams quicker. Right, we're always going to be solving some form of a problem, but ideally the problems that we're solving are new ones or different ones at least. And so to do that, we have to have a way of monitoring the health of our team or organization. And these are the feedback loops and contexts I've mentioned before, and they can take many different forms, but the point is that we should make it easy to find patterns that serve as input for short-term and long-term improvements by building robust feedback loops. Feedback loops ultimately serve the function of communicating context and pain points throughout the team, which is important for ensuring that people feel heard. And so I started off this talk by saying understanding risk and planning for failure is a tenet of creating psychological safety, right? Problems will arise. It's inevitable, but the upfront investment that you put into building robust feedback loops will drive your team towards being in a preventative or proactive state instead of one that's reactive. And so to ground this into an example, right, one really robust source of feedback is on-call. Right, the experience of on-call is a great feedback loop for improving the way that your technology and your team works, because we can learn something from every alert, every page, and every on-call task. And all of this is really powerful data that can be used to improve ourselves and our systems. Next, you should be strategic about how your team prevents chronic issues from happening in the first place. And so going back to our feedback loops, right, we should be constantly learning from these feedback loops over time, building our team's collective knowledge on how to manage reliability effectively and build excellent software. And this is really important for morale because people feel good when they produce excellent work, which is why I lean more heavily on the design and production phases of engineering. Now, we have to balance that with being able to ship quickly, right? So when I say this, I think everyone's first instinct is to kind of hold their breath because they think I like to run my team slowly, but I've actually always found the opposite to be true. By investing early and continuously, we aren't constantly distracted by systems that are defined by their inability to be reliable. And the most successful projects I've seen that, yes, were delivered on time, were ones where a lot of thought was put into the software design and production readiness parts of building software, because they ultimately made development a lot more smoother and built confidence for when we actually released. Now, when you're not in this mode, it is really hard to get here, right? It involves a degree of trust that the time you invest more upfront will pay off later. And so when I first introduced this way of engineering on a previous team, I heard a lot of initial pushback from my cross-functional peers who were concerned about productivity. And so for the folks who are on teams that feel like rushing is causing a lot of your production problems and feel stuck in this cycle of rushing, choose one project to try this out and see how it goes. And if it goes well, use it as a model for getting buy-in and driving long-term change. Now, this long-term approach has to be complemented with a short-term approach for when our long-term approach inevitably falls through from time to time, which is why having a strategy of how you hold your team accountable to itself is important. The strategies or frameworks should be transparent and aligned with our core principles. Decision-making shouldn't be happening in a silo, and your team should feel like they are part of the process. And so luckily, the tech industry has come up with one solution to this need, which is service level objectives and error budget policies. And so service level objectives, or SLOs, introduce transparency by defining reliability targets. It clarifies our collective expectations around what reliability experience we're trying to provide users. And so when coupled with error budgets, which define the measures that we take when we stop meeting those expectations, SLOs introduce an extra layer of accountability that makes teams more resilient to failure. Now, let's talk about a very common source of pain for teams, and again, that's on-call. And so most engineers I know don't look forward to on-call. Incident management, again, can be stressful, and so especially when the state of your on-call is best described as chaos. But that shouldn't be the case, right? If your engineers dread your on-call, that means the state of your on-call is unhealthy. And so incidents and on-call noise aren't the only source of pain with on-call shifts, though. I see an unfortunately very common expectation for on-call engineers to balance the work of on-call with their long-term project work, and I totally consider this an anti-pattern. Not only is that unfair, but it also introduces instability to your roadmap if you're depending on engineers to make progress in the context of a deadline. And so because of this, I prefer to avoid this attention altogether by having what I refer to as dedicated on-call shifts. So what I mean by this is that instead of forcing on-call engineers to balance both on-call and long-term project work, reinforce our empowerment principle by empowering the engineers on call to take ownership over how they spend their on-call time outside of incidents. This not only relieves the stress of needing to manage incidents and project work at the same time, but it also communicates a trust in teammates to help make on-call better over time by providing a steady avenue of creative freedom for them to solve problems that bother them the most. And the reason I don't consider this a long-term approach is because you won't be able to only rely on dedicated on-call to mitigate your issues. Right? Not every issue or improvement is going to fit into an on-call shift, but it is an additional layer of reassurance, and it's a powerful way of keeping your team accountable to itself. And so, lastly, it shouldn't be only one leader holding the team accountable. By falling into that pattern, we're introducing a huge dependency on that leader to hold our team to its values. And much like a dependency introduces system vulnerabilities, so does the singular leader. And so even if our org or team isn't large, we should find ways to reduce our team's dependency on leaders. Maybe that means making sure that your team has strong relationships with their skip levels or some other leader in our org. The goal here is to promote a sustainable leadership model for our team and organization, one where power is distributed so that leaders can use each other's strengths to serve the shared goal of building excellent, healthy teams. So now let's switch to the proactive state. In the proactive state, a potentially chronic problem has emerged, but it hasn't caused significant problems yet, but we don't want them to get any worse. So because we have ways of proactively monitoring for early indicators, we can address issues before they have long-term impact. And so I mentioned earlier that the most vulnerable people in an organization or community are the first ones to feel dysfunction. And so we need to make sure that our feedback loops capture a range of perspectives. We need to dig into the granularity of our experiences or behavior because different issues will affect people differently. But that doesn't mean they aren't just as important. And so this is best served by having multiple sources of feedback loops with the stern reminder that too much process can introduce its own set of problems. And more importantly, we should focus on making the feedback actionable. That way, when we revisit our processes during times that are usually designated to strike that balance of focus and retrospection used to iterate and address pain points. And so having worked for companies with tons of bureaucracy, I've seen too many processes be a source of harm instead. And so our initial solutions might not end up working, and instead of forcing teams to accommodate the process, we should be able to adjust the process to accommodate the needs of our teams. So even though we should always be looking for new areas of improvements, it's okay and even essential that we celebrate the progress that we do make, right? So show gratitude for the ways that our teams step up, for the times that people show when they care about preserving psychological safety. And so a lot of us have retros, either maybe general team retros or project-specific ones. And so make space for explicit celebration during those rituals. And revisit your pre-mortems to see what risks you identified that ended up not happening. And then lastly, make space during incident postmortems to celebrate the things that your team did well during what was probably a really stressful time. And lastly, there is the reactive approach. At this point, the chronic issue has already had a negative impact on our team or organization, and we're kind of forced into addressing it. And once we've reached a state that an issue is a chronic issue, it becomes a lot harder to solve, and it becomes a lot harder to restore our team's sense of safety. Because at this point, right, teams are probably lost trust in their leaders, they probably lost trust in the organization in general, and at worst case scenario, they also lost trust in each other. But now, instead of taking this as a signal to make change happen, what I often see is that organizations come to rely on acts of heroism until the point that people reach burnout. And when I say heroism and burnout here, I'm not just referring to the type of burnout that we tend to focus on, which is overworking. I'm also referring to the type of emotional burnout that happens when someone's in an environment that is unhealthy, whether that's something like chronic underappreciation because we're so focused on the work, or something more severe like having to deal with bias and harassment in the name of a learning lesson for the people that are causing harm. And so it goes without saying, heroism and burnout are not effective strategies for organizational failures. Because ultimately, that's what we're asking of people when they're put in that situation, to make up for the organizational failures by sacrificing their well-being. Now, let's expand on the cultural and organizational consequences of heroism some more. So heroes prevent true progress because they're ultimately just band-aids to systemic issues. They prevent progress by enabling us to put off the hard work of actually addressing those deeper organizational flaws. And so kind of like tech debt, right? It might be effective in the short term, but it's not an effective long-term strategy for building sustainable organizations. Eventually, we have to pay that tech debt back. And the way that we pay that back tends to be in the form of burnout. And so not only is that awful for the people who have to experience that, but it's also awful for organizations. We all know how awful it is when an organization leaves, and so we shouldn't be giving them reasons to leave. And if we're in a situation where our only choice is to engage in heroics, we should push back and say no if we're in the position to. And if we're not in that position or are forced into engaging in heroics anyway, we should take that as information for whether this is the type of environment we even want to be a part of. And lastly, the impact of heroism isn't distributed equally. It looks different depending on your personhood. For some, it's a point of celebration. For others, it's just merely an extension of what might already be a psychologically unsafe environment. So for example, when people with more power present themselves as heroes in the workplace, they're often celebrated for it. But for others, it can feel like just an expansion of what might already be unfair expectations. And so setting the precedent of heroism only means furthering the unfair expectations placed on vulnerable people. And this is what we mean when they say that underrepresented people have to work twice as hard to get half the celebration, right? Who we chose to celebrate is a reflection of our values and coded in our biases. And the privilege of choice to participate in heroics isn't one that's afforded to everyone. The second part of this consequence here is that heroism often leads to disproportional power between teammates. Earlier I said how leaders should reduce the team's dependency on themselves, right? But this applies to everyone in a team or organization. Heroism is dangerous because it redistributes power by putting people in a position where they have to depend on heroes. And this is why the part about having strong leadership is so important. When a team or organization becomes so dependent on one person, especially when that person is a leader, it can start to feel like they're untouchable, like they're incapable of doing any wrong or of being held accountable. And so what do we do when we get here? And so unfortunately, I'm here to deliver some perhaps but obvious truths. When a team reaches this state of being, leaders are the ones that are responsible for the organizational failures that got them there. Blameless postmortem culture is a wonderful tool, but it does not apply to leadership. In fact, a crucial part of blameless culture is that you shift towards identifying the systemic reasons that cause the problem. And so while blameless postmortem culture might not agree that individuals or that leaders are at fault for these issues, blameless postmortem culture definitely agrees that leaders are responsible for them. And this is a thing that we see leaders struggle more than anything else. It can be really hard to reconcile the fact that most of the problems that we have to solve in our work aren't directly our fault, but that they are our responsibility. And that ironically, as much as we don't want to cast blame and whatnot, it's when we ignore our responsibility as leaders that things actually start to become our fault. Now, another hard truth, sometimes you or your leadership core are those leaders. And the onus is on us to take that responsibility. And sometimes what responsibility looks like is holding whoever's in leadership to us accountable in the ways that we have access to, but it's just as important that we recognize the role that we play in organizational failures. Because the higher up in leadership that we are, the more our flaws have the potential to scale across our organization. And so use whatever access you have to action on that responsibility. Sometimes we have to be strategic about when to use the privilege that comes with leadership, especially for those of us who are more underrepresented. But generally speaking, most people tend to underestimate and underutilize that privilege in the context of leadership, but in the context of the world generally. So I've thrown this word responsibility a lot and given no direction on what that actually looks like. And taking responsibility is wildly complex, but I think the approach can be generalized down to 3 steps. So the first is to admit where you went wrong, right? Admit that we played a role in letting it get that way, whether our role was one that was direct or one of enablement. The people we lead will actually appreciate us a lot more for being vulnerable about where we went wrong, especially when we follow up with action. Because psychological safety is about feeling safe to make mistakes while trusting that you're in an environment that seeks to minimize psychological harm through accountability. And this is the core of what it means to actually be trauma-informed. It's not just about feeling safe that we as individuals can make mistakes. It's also about preserving safety in spite of the mistakes that will inevitably end up happening. Which is why the second step of taking responsibility is centering the folks impacted. This is where we really need to practice empathy, right? Who was harmed in the process? Who had to step up as a hero or a leader because we didn't? And so we should thank them, reward them, ask them what they need to rebuild trust. And we might not always be able to provide what they need, and oftentimes, truthfully, it might be even too late to rebuild that trust anyway. But at the very least, they deserve to have their experience honored through change and actions. And more selfishly, their thoughts and words can serve as a reminder that the work of leadership isn't often about us, it's about the teams that we lead. And lastly, there are all the actual changes you follow up with. That means revisiting the preventative and proactive measures that you have in place. We should ask ourselves, where did our processes fail to get us here? What cultural organizational flaws contributed to the situation? And so tying back to what we just talked through in the last slide, when centering those impacted, ask for their thoughts and on these questions without placing the burden on them. And we can do this by putting our own thoughts into what changes we think will be impactful and asking for what did we miss? Because what's not obvious to us might be very obvious to them. And so ask them because the experiences and feedback that they provide is powerful data for how we can improve our organization. And we should always consider the vulnerability that comes with sharing these experiences and thoughts a gift. And we can honor that gift by following up with action. Depending on the situation, what these actions look like vary very widely, but approach it from a systems thinking angle, right? What organizational change can we drive to remedy the situation and make sure that it doesn't happen again? And depending on the situation, we might have to make some tough decisions. This is really hard, right? But it's also really crucial because threats to psychological safety aren't a trade-off that we should make lightly. Leadership is earned and not owed continuously. Just like the flaws of an organization are felt by our most vulnerable coworkers, so are the flaws of our leaders. And so one final note, I know none of this is easy, right? All of this is much easier said than it is done. And so my hardest moments as a team or a tech lead were ones where I had to deal with a lot of these types of complex issues, whether that was stepping up in light of difficult situations like harassment or bias, or driving serious change to culture that enables burnout. And every single one does kind of take a little bit out of you, if I'm being honest, but ultimately that's the price we pay for the privilege of leadership. And as leaders, we should never lose sight of that privilege, the privilege to cultivate culture, to cultivate community, in a way that achieves excellence without sacrificing people along the way. And in a world where sacrificing people in the name of business needs is so unfortunately common, choose to bring this energy, this way of thinking, in all the ways that you have access to. Trust me that as hard or as frankly scary as it might be, having been on the side where my access to that was very minimal, the heartache that often comes with leadership is still one of the best privileges I've ever had. And so honor that privilege by being honest with yourself and others about where your organization isn't doing right by people and where you might not even be doing right by people. And ultimately, right, this is why we attend conferences like this, right? To refine our craft by being exposed to other people with experiences that we can learn from. And so honor your craft as a leader by surrounding yourself around people who you can hold accountable and who will hold you accountable and whom you could do the same for. Leadership can be very lonely, but it doesn't have to be, for our sake and especially for the sake of the people we have the privilege to lead. Thank you.